Hey, I'm Noam Weissman, and you're listening to Unpacking Israeli History, the podcast that takes a deep dive into some of the most intense, historically fascinating, and often misunderstood events and stories linked to Israeli history. This episode is dedicated in memory of Armin Lindenbaum, the grandson of Rabbi Avigdor Amiel, by his wife Jean, and children Felice, Amiel, and Ariel Lindenbaum Sabag. If you're interested in sponsoring an episode of Unpacking Israeli History, or even just saying, what's up, be in touch at noam@unpacked.media. Tell me I'm wrong about everything. Tell me I'm right about everything. Heck, tell me my hair looks good today. At this point, I'm just happy to have hair. To be honest, not so obvious for a 39-year-old Ashkenazi Jew. Whatever you want to tell me, I'm here for it. Welcome back to part 2 of our two-parter on one of the thorniest issues in the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Palestinian refugee crisis. This episode is not going to make a ton of sense if you haven't listened to part 1, so be sure to do that before you keep going with this one, because we're going to get deep in the historical weeds. We're also on Instagram and YouTube. Just search Unpacking Israeli History and hit the follow or subscribe button. Before we start, I want to acknowledge something important. We've gotten a lot of feedback, an amazing amount of feedback about part 1 of this episode, which is so important to hear from everyone in this community. That's the way I view the Unpacking Israeli History story. Basically, it's asking us, hey, are you going to talk about Jewish Israelis who were displaced during the war, like the 60,000 who had to flee their homes, or the 10,000 kicked out by the Jordanians, their homes destroyed, or are you going to tell their stories? And their answer is, sort of. We mention them in this episode, but we don't go into all the detail, and that's for this very specific reason. This series is dedicated specifically to telling a couple of stories from the Palestinian exodus. We want to expose the audience to a side of the history they might not know, and to provide context for that story. We didn't want to do the whole whataboutism thing. This isn't about comparing refugee experiences. Yes, it's important to mention the different experiences of refugees, and we mention Jewish refugees when relevant. But the bulk of these episodes is dedicated to the Palestinian story. So if you find yourself getting enraged while you listen, muttering under your breath, they didn't even talk about Kfar Etzion. They didn't even talk about the Jews of the Old City. I see you. I hear you. I get it. And it's true. We have a couple of episodes dedicated to the destruction of Jewish villages by the Jordanians in 1948. It's a very real story. Yes, link in the show notes. But this two-part series is specifically about the Palestinians. So thank you for your feedback. Thank you for your messages. And thank you always for listening and learning and keeping an open mind. Okay, yalla, let's do this.
אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל. היא מדינת ישראל.
We, the people of Israel, are prepared and anxious to meet the representatives of our neighbors without any preconditions.
There are people in Israel and elsewhere say it's impossible to make peace between the Arabs and Israel or the Jewish people. I think they are wrong.
There's nothing like being a parent to make you regret every single thing you ever did as a kid, right? Especially when my kids are fighting. It's like I'm being back in time to when I was 16, 17 years old, and my siblings and I are playing an endless card game on a Saturday afternoon on Shabbat for us. And one of my siblings has absolutely cheated. Looking at you, Dani, yeah, I said it. Maybe you were 8 or 9 years old at the time, but I caught you, okay? All I ever wanted was for Dani to just admit it, to just say, yeah, I cheated. Yeah, like that's part of, like, I don't know, this siblings when they play games, like that happens all the time. But he never did admit it, and I probably didn't either. But anyway, here's how this worked. Because he's my little brother and being infuriating is in the contract of little siblings, he just wouldn't. Instead, he would double down, insisting that I should stop being such a liar. And then my parents would have to step in to mediate, and it was the whole thing that usually ended with everyone crying. Okay, again, this isn't really a true story, but you get it, right? Like, that was a totally made up story, but like, you get the concept of it. Sorry, Dani, for throwing you under a bus there. This didn't happen. But here's the thing about situations like this. It's not even the cheating that bothers you the most. It's the fact that your dumb little sibling won't admit it. Won't say, okay, you're right. He knows you're right, and you know you're right, and he knows you know, and that's his leverage over you. The more you want him to admit it, the less likely he is going to do so. This extends to much more than sibling rivalries. The human need for validation is deep and primal. All we really want is for someone to see us, to acknowledge our narrative, to say, hey, you weren't just making that up. Your experience was real. Even if recollections may vary, your version, your truth is real to you. There's nothing lonelier than being the only person who believes in your version of events. Like you're standing on a little island of truth in the middle of a sea of denial, or an island in the middle of Denial River. See what I did there? You're shouting for someone to come for you, but no one's paying attention. Or worse, they're leaning over the side of a lifeboat to tell you that you're not really about to drown. You're not even on an island, actually. This whole scenario is in your head. And when someone refuses to see your hurt and refuses to acknowledge their part in it, you're kind of at a dead end. Seriously, where do you go from there? How do you reconcile? That's one of the questions that the Israeli legal philosopher Chaim Gans poses in his important book, A Just Zionism. It's a book that I don't think many people have read. It's kind of hard to find. But if we had an Unpacking Israeli History book club, I'd put a sticker on this book, Noam's pick. Gans's book offers some of the most nuanced takes I've heard or ever read on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And he doesn't shy away from the heavy stuff. Let me state up front, I don't agree with all of his conclusions at all. But I deeply respect how he tackles the issues. He asks questions like, when we talk about the conflict, are all sides working from the same starting points? Do we agree on the same set of facts, on the vocabulary we used to discuss those facts, on what those facts even mean? It all sounds abstract and theoretical, but it isn't. It isn't. Gans gets deep into the moral weeds, carefully parsing the perspectives of the left and the right and everyone in between. From there, he makes a compelling argument for realistic and durable solutions. Okay, I've made it sound like he's presented the solution to the conflict in 200 pages, all tied up in a neat bow. That's not exactly the case. Gans isn't some Pollyanna-ish bozo. He acknowledges how hard and complex it is to cut through overlapping layers of trauma and find a way forward. But he argues rather emphatically that it is precisely those moral ambiguities and disagreements that make it imperative, his word, for both sides to come to some kind of compromise. And the starting point for that compromise is acknowledgement that both sides are coming from a valid place. That doesn't mean their behaviors are always, but that both sides have suffered injustices, that both versions of history have kernels of truth to them. Now, this is hard for people who like to demonstrate that they're on extreme sides no matter what, and they're going to be polarized and partisan, but this is what he does. And his framing of the Palestinian refugee issue gets at the heart of the need for acknowledgement. I'm going to read to you what he says in his own words. Quote, even if the war that the Jewish state fought for its independence was forced upon it, thereby becoming a just war, this did not justify expulsions, nor did it justify the confiscation of land and houses that had been left by those who fled in fear of the war. Admittedly, some of these actions may merit forgiveness because of the exceptional circumstances of the times and the justifiable fears engendered by those circumstances. Nevertheless, not all of the Jewish community's actions can be considered justified. Israel, therefore, should acknowledge, keyword here, a certain degree of responsibility for the injustices experienced by the Palestinians. And let's be clear. To those who deny the Jewish people's right to a Jewish state in the land of Israel, let me remind you, the Jews did not ask for war. The day after the United Nations voted on partition, local Palestinian Arabs launched attacks on Jewish civilians, starting a civil war that eventually led to a mass exodus of Palestinians from their homes and bringing us to today's Palestinian refugee crisis. Over 5 million people claiming to be refugees jostling to return. But what triggered this initial flight? Well, in part, it was the fact that, war sucks. But as you heard in part 1, the war was awful, in part because both sides used some dodgy tactics to fight it, like attacking civilians or taking over villages and expelling their inhabitants. Yes, Gans writes, the war was forced on the Jews of the Yishuv. That is true. And pause on that for a moment. And that doesn't mean they always prosecuted it justly, which means that the state of Israel needs to acknowledge some level of responsibility for the injustices of the war, and not just because it's politically expedient. For Gans, this acknowledgement is a moral issue. And that doesn't make it easy. History is ambiguous, slippery, subject to endless debate. This is why you can spend an entire semester unpacking a single decade. It's why hundreds of books can tell the same story with infinite variations. It's why there's no straight answer to, so tell me about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Come on. It's all kind of depends on who you ask. Because history also isn't just abstract or academic. There's so much bound up in the stories we tell ourselves. The story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict cuts both sides to the core. And if we don't acknowledge the pain bound up in each side's story, we're never going to get anywhere. I mean, this is where we've gotten to without doing that, right? Is this where we want to be? So let's do this a little bit differently. Let's finish the story we started, which, if you'll recall, went something like this. After World War I, the Brits take charge of Palestine, which had been under Ottoman control for the past 400 years. These jolly old Englishmen do their best, more or less, to mediate between the Arabs and the Jews vying for control of the land. But it's not a great situation. Lots of bloodshed, lots of ugliness, and by 1947, the Brits are like, we're out. They hand the issue over to the newly formed United Nations, whose job it is to make sure World War III doesn't break out. And the UN comes up with a plan. Let's just split the region of Palestine into two. One Arab state, one Jewish state. Nailed it. The borders they propose are complicated. But hey, a Jewish state, someone in the previous episode didn't like when I said bonkers, so I changed it to complicated. But hey, a Jewish state, very difficult borders is better than no Jewish state, right? Like that's the thinking. So the Jews, totally desperate after 2,000 years of praying to return to the land of Israel, accept the plan, as does the majority of the United Nations. But the Arab side has been hijacked by extremists who have spent the past decade intimidating or killing off any moderate voices. So they say no freaking way. All the Arab and Muslim states walked out of the room when the results were announced. The next day, Palestinians begin attacking Jews, plunging the region into civil war. At first, the Jews play defense kind of like the early aughts Detroit Pistons or the late 80s Detroit Pistons. Yeah, some of you got that, some of you totally didn't. Responding to attacks but not preempting them. By late March of 1948, it became devastatingly clear that if they wanted to win this war, they'd have to go on the offensive. They turned their sights towards strategically located Palestinian villages and give the inhabitants a choice: surrender and have your village turned into a military garrison, or leave and have your village turned into a military garrison. Soon, Palestinians were fleeing en masse, a steady stream of refugees in search of safety. By May of 1948, roughly 300,000 Palestinian Arabs had been displaced. And then came May 14th, 1948, the day David Ben-Gurion declared independence for the Jewish people in the homeland of Israel, in the Jewish state. The Brits are gone. The civil war is still raging, and the Arab countries that surround the Jewish state are drawing closer, hungrily licking their lips. That's where we left off. But for Israelis and for many Jewish people, this is, in many ways, where history begins. Chapter 3, A State is Born. May 14th, 1948, 4 p.m. A small man with flyaway hair and a dour expression ascends a stage in the Tel Aviv Museum. Before him is a beaming audience of men and women who have dedicated their lives to ushering in this very moment. But before he can open his mouth to speak, the room breaks into song. Soon, the Palestine Philharmonic Orchestra joins in. There is no one who doesn't know the words. Because the song they're singing is, of course, Hatikva, the Hope, which would later become Israel's national anthem. And the short, unsmiling man with absolutely crazy hair is David Ben-Gurion, up till then the head of the Yishuv in Palestine. In a few moments, he will be the first prime minister of the modern state of Israel. You would think he'd be smiling. He's worked towards this moment for decades. His staff has spent weeks writing and rewriting the Declaration of Independence, and he has spent the past few hours rewriting their rewrites and arguing over every single word. And the words are beautiful, inspiring, iconic.
אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל.
We hereby declare the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel, to be known as the State of Israel. It is the single greatest Jewish triumph of the past 2,000 years. I'll admit it, I'm biased. To me, it's among the greatest triumphs of human history. I still get goosebumps when I hear this recording. Jewish people returning to the land they were exiled from 2,000 years ago, They were homeless for 1900 years, and now they are returning to be on the stage of world history again after 2,000 years. That's incredible. That's a wild moment. No matter where you stand politically, religiously, that's a wild moment. And yet Ben-Gurion, he isn't smiling. Later that night, he writes in his diary, quote, "Across the land there is joy and profound happiness, and again I mourn among the joyful." Because, quote, "Harsh news about armored columns of the Legion. They bombed Tel Aviv last night. The fate of the Jewish state," he writes, "is in the hands of the security forces." For the past 6 months, the Yishuv has been ripped apart by bitter fighting. The Jews, who are now Israelis, versus local Palestinian militias aided by the Arab Liberation Army. It's been incredibly ugly. Massacres, people burned alive, emptied villages, expulsions, defiled bodies. And it is about to get worse, because the ALA and the Palestinian militias have been waiting for the Arab countries to join the fight. Now that the British are gone, it's showtime. So of course Ben-Gurion isn't smiling. Less than 24 hours after he spoke Israel into existence, the neighbors showed up, squeezing the Jewish state from all sides. Egypt overran the southern border, while the deadly Jordanian Arab Legion took the east. Troops from Syria and Iraq loomed in the northeast. The Lebanese army sat at the northern border, ready to pounce. Israel's only neutral neighbor was the Mediterranean Sea to the west, and it was no help at all. The security forces that would soon become the IDF were on their own, pitching fierce, desperate battles against 5 other countries, while also fighting the ALA and Palestinian militias. The day he declared independence, Ben-Gurion lamented that the Jewish forces weren't aggressive enough. Quote, "Almost all the general staff members opposed my view to attack with greater force and more stubborn energy to conquer the areas around the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem highway. I feel that they missed and are missing the conquest that will determine the fate of Jerusalem and perhaps the fate of the entire campaign. Conquer is not a neutral word. It's what the Jewish militias have been doing or trying to do since April. It's the linchpin of Tochnit Dalet, Plan D, whose entire aim was to prevent Palestinian villages near Israel's borders from becoming staging grounds or military bases for the invading Arab armies. Because if the invaders got hold of those villages, they could cut the country in half. The state would be dead before it got a chance to live. So conquering wasn't a matter of expansionism, it was a matter of survival. For most IDF commanders, it was also moot. Up and down the country, few commanders were forced to decide what to do with Palestinian villagers because many of their villages were already empty. Their people had fled ahead of the advancing Israeli troops. So the IDF had no clear policy on Palestinian villages. Instead, they relied on the ad hoc decisions of whatever commanders were in the field. And that's why every Palestinian village has a different story. Sometimes IDF commanders would clear villages of their inhabitants or get drawn into a firefight when the villagers would attack. Sometimes the IDF attacked first. Sometimes they would just sweep for weapons, confiscate anything suspicious, and then move on and leave the people in peace. Of course, not every encounter between the IDF and the Palestinians resulted in bloodshed or expulsion or even the Palestinians fleeing preemptively. Sometimes Palestinian villagers stayed exactly where they were. So even though IDF field commanders were supposed to use Tochnit Dalet as a framework for fighting, that didn't always happen. War is messy. People are messy. And it was all a hash of circumstances, and the left hand didn't always know what the right hand was doing. I mean, that happens in my own organization, right? Like, this could happen. It's awful what happens during war, but it happens. There is no single Palestinian experience of the war of 1948, just as there's no single Jewish experience either. Everyone has a different story. But a particular incident has shaped many Palestinian narratives. Like the story of Deir Yassin, it has become a symbol, a collective memory. It's like a tale of two cities, and like the Dickens novel, it's not a happy one. We're back. When we left off, I was about to tell you a tale of two cities, hopefully with fewer words than Dickens used. Those two cities were Lita and Ramla, which brings us to Chapter 4, Lita and Ramla. Maybe you've heard of Lita and Ramla. If you've ever flown into Ben Gurion Airport, you've actually been to Lita, though today it's called Lod, just as it was thousands of years ago. Nerd Corner alert, ancient Lod was home to the great Tannaitic sages, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Tarfon, easily in the top 10 of rabbis of the Mishnaic period. Cool stuff. By the way, Tannaitic means from the time period of when the Mishnah was written, just to clarify that term. Anyway, today, both Lida/Lod and Ramla/Ramla are mixed cities within Israel, home to Arabs and Jews alike. But back in 1947, they were Arab cities, located right next to each other, straddling the road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. We'll put a map in the show notes for you to just see it, because it's important to understand this. In the original partition plan, these cities would have been a part of Arab Palestine, but no one, not even the UN, was enforcing these proposed borders or, making sure Jews and Arabs weren't killing each other. Fighters from Lida and Ramla alike pressed their advantage, attacking Jewish vehicles on the nearby roads and eventually triggering a reprisal from the Haganah and the Irgun, two of the three Jewish paramilitaries that would soon consolidate to become the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces. Lida and Ramla may have had their share of angry fighters, but their leaders wanted to stay out of the violence. City officials had no interest in going on the offensive unless Jewish militias attacked them first. In fact, the mayor of Lida even met with the leader of the Jewish Agricultural School of Ben Shemen, a little enclave of Jews just kilometers away, and both sides agreed that they would leave each other alone. Jewish convoys would pass through Lida unharmed, and the Jews of Ben Shemen wouldn't post guards on the road. But neither side was naive. The mayor of Lida and the head of Ben Shemen warned one another that they were not responsible for rabble-rousers who might disrupt the peace they'd established. In other words, both sides knew that this coexistence agreement was fragile. So fragile, in fact, that even before Israel declared independence, many of Ramla's inhabitants had already fled. And now it was summer of 1948, and Israel was staring down 5 invading armies, including the deadly Jordanian Arab Legion, which set up shop in, you guessed it, Lida and Ramla. It was a great location for the Jordanians, and decidedly less great for the Israelis. Both cities were perfectly located between Tel Aviv to the west and Jerusalem to the east, which meant there were 3 worst-case scenarios. 1, the Arab Legion would once again be able to cut off Jerusalem and besiege its inhabitants. 2, the Arab Legion would make it to Tel Aviv. 3, all of the above. Okay, I guess it's 2 terrible outcomes and 1 worst-case scenario. Either way, it's bad news. So the Israelis devised a plan they called Operation Dani to ensure that the road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem would stay open, which meant the IDF had to conquer Lida and Ramla. It would be a mess, because unlike smaller villages, neither Lida nor Ramla were empty. Together, they housed between 50,000 and 70,000 Palestinian Arabs, 20,000 of whom had already fled their homes in Jaffa. They were also housing Arab Legion soldiers. Honestly, I'm not even sure that the city leaders knew those soldiers were there. I don't know. And though Israel and the Arab countries had declared a brief truce earlier in the summer, that ceasefire was scheduled to end on July 9th, which meant that the Arab Legion had time to dig in, shore up its defenses, and launch a spectacular attack. By the way, just parenthetical note, this is the reason that some people don't like to do ceasefires, because what it does is it allows the other side ready. That's what it does. So Israel, in this instance, had to be ready the second the truce was over, and that meant taking Lida and Ramla that July. Otherwise, the Israelis risked losing everything. You with me? You're understanding the context? Okay. But there was something that Israel didn't know. The Arab Legion had set up shop in both cities, but it was a very, very small shop. Only 200 Jordanian troops fanned out across Lida and Ramla, barely enough to constitute a serious threat, and certainly not enough to justify Operation Dani, as far as I see. But the IDF didn't know that. They didn't know that. They thought Lida and Ramla were overrun, absolutely lousy with thousands of Jordanian soldiers, and so they devised a drastic plan to get the Arab Legion to fold. For the inhabitants of Lida and Ramla, July 10th began with a shower of bombs. The next day brought a torrent of machine gun fire, followed shortly by the IDF's 89th Battalion. By the end of that awful day, 6 Israeli soldiers were dead and 21 wounded. Dozens of Palestinians had been killed, and the Arab Legion, whose presence had triggered this whole disaster, had turned tail and fled. They were soon joined by thousands of Palestinians fleeing both cities with little more than the clothes on their backs. So when the IDF dropped leaflets the next day ordering a surrender, they expected both cities to comply immediately. Ramla did. Lida did not. The Arab Legion had returned. Together, Palestinians and Arab Legion fighters met the IDF with guns blazing. The firefight was intense, and Lita's civilians were caught in the crossfire. When the dust finally cleared on July 12th, 3 or 4 IDF soldiers had been killed and dozens more wounded. Meanwhile, 250 Palestinian Arabs, including women and children, lay dead in the streets. The IDF rounded up all the men of fighting age left in both Ramla and Lita as prisoners of war. But they had absolutely no plan for everyone else, and only terrible options. So they chose the one that was best for them, for Israel, as they were fighting this war, as they were fighting for survival. The firefight had barely ended when the orders came down, expel them all. And that's exactly what the IDF was preparing to do when Israel's Minister of Minority Affairs showed up. Horrified, he appealed to the powers that be. And when Ben-Gurion got wind of the situation, he insisted that no one had to leave. He and his foreign minister even dashed off updated guidelines for the soldiers in the field, which stated basically, you can take POWs, but you can't expel anyone. But the people of Lita and Ramla didn't want to just abandon their men to the Israeli detention camp. So they approached the IDF and promised, release the POWs and all of us will leave our homes. Scouts honor. Scouts honor. The IDF agreed. The people of Ramla and Lita collected their men, and then they left their homes under the scorching July sun. Mazen al-Khairi was just a little boy at the time, living in Ramla with his family. Here's how he remembers the expulsion.
Well, they came into each house at gunpoint, you leave. Each family was taken outside their houses on the street, and then we had to walk into sort of gathering areas. We were lucky. They put us in a bus, not a truck. And we were driven to the border, and they started shooting over our heads to make us run. They took the elder member of the family. He was maybe at the time, maybe he was 70 years old. And the soldier took his wallet. I remember this very, very well. So, anyway, they took more than the wallet. They took everything.
It was a sorry sight. Thousands of people carrying whatever possessions they could scrounge, trudging into the unknown. The march out of Lita was terrible. I'm going to put a trigger warning on the next 30 seconds, so you might want to skip ahead a bit, especially if you're a parent. Mothers left their crying babies by the side of the road because they had no food to give them. Others peeled off from the group to bury infants who had long stopped crying. Elderly people collapsed in the brutal summer heat, buried where they fell. But the story didn't end there, because not every Palestinian Arab left. And over the next few months, some more Palestinians managed stealthily to return. By October of 1948, there were about 2,000 Palestinians living in Lita and Ramla. 2,000, where there had once been between 50 and 70,000. Today, Ramla and Lod are mixed cities within Israel, where Israeli citizens of all backgrounds live side by side. But proximity isn't the same as true coexistence. Coexistence is a really hard thing to do, not just if you're in Israel, wherever you live. Because I'm prepared to bet that every Arab in Ramla and Lod knows about its history. And I'm equally prepared to bet that most Jews, in fact, many Israeli Jews and American Jews and people across the world, were only introduced to this terrible story in 2013 when Israeli journalist Ari Shavit published My Promised Land, The Triumph and Tragedy of Israel. Now, Shavit is controversial for a few reasons, but we'll stick to the one that's most relevant to us for this content. The chapter on Lita sparked quite the conversation for people across the world, inspiring countless articles and counter-articles dissecting the history, debating the veracity of Shavit's version of events. And Shavit's a journalist, not a historian, okay? But for some Israelis, just telling the story felt like betrayal. It's really, really tough to acknowledge that nothing is black and white, to admit that there are dark and ugly beats in the epic story of the Jewish people's return home. And it's really hard to lower our defenses and understand that triumph and tragedy, to borrow from Shavit, can coexist in the same moment, the same event. It's not a Disney story. But this is precisely the kind of thing we should be talking about, certainly now. That is why this podcast exists. You listening, you know this. That's why you're here, to grapple with the whole story and with the holes in the Jewish people's narratives, with the toughest moments and uglier angles of our history. We also tell the beautiful and celebratory moments, but we need to tell these stories. And when I say we, I mean everyone affected by this conflict. There is nothing more human than a story, and nothing more humanizing than listening to someone else's. And the story of the Palestinian refugee crisis is ongoing because most Palestinians did not come back. And in so many cases, there was nothing to go back to. In many cases, their old villages had new names and new inhabitants, and others, their villages simply did not exist. To this day, the Palestinians remain a nation in limbo, which brings us to the final chapter of this tale. Chapter 5, What Now? The refugee crisis began before Israel declared independence. By the time David Ben-Gurion ascended that makeshift stage, roughly 300,000 Palestinian Arabs had already fled. Some set up shop in areas that the UN had earmarked for a Palestinian state. By the way, at this point in time, it's important to note, it was known as an Arab state. It's an important clarification. When the UN was making two states, it said Arab state and Jewish state. That's what it was called, because the region was known as Palestine, and there was going to be an Arab state and a Jewish state. They didn't have names for these states at this point. They didn't exist. So some set up shop in areas that the UN had earmarked for an Arab state, including the West Bank and Gaza. Though, of course, no one was actually enforcing the partition plan. But many streamed into neighboring countries, and those countries that were beginning to make a big stink about the hundreds of thousands of refugees at their doors, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, literally wanted the Jews to pay for the costs of housing and feeding these refugees, which honestly might be my favorite example of chutzpah in history. But chutzpah aside, the question remained, what to do with the 300,000 Palestinian refugees spread out across the region? Well, if you asked said refugees, the answer was simple. They would just go back to their villages and cities and towns. Duh. They dealt with hostilities before during the revolt of 1936 to 1939. And yes, link in the show notes, hundreds of people had skipped town, only to return when the region quieted. So why should this time be any different? But this time was different, because this time Israel existed. The Jewish state existed. It returned to history. And the Israelis weren't so sure about letting 300,000 people, many of them hostile, back within their tiny borders. There were some dissenting voices, of course, there always are. Politicians who argued that at least some number of Palestinians should be allowed to come back. Mayor Ya'ari from the Mapam party and his party leadership recommended that, quote, with the return of peace, they, meaning the Arabs, should return to a life of peace, honor, and productivity. The property of the returnees will be restored to them. Eliyahu Sasson, the director of the Foreign Ministry's Middle East Affairs Department, advocated for the return of something like 40 to 50,000 refugees. But their voices were drowned out by the majority who were against a return. Remember, do the whole empathy thing. Put yourself in the position. Try to do it. Go back. Go back to 48, 49, 50. Go back. The newfound state of Israel had just spent 6 months fighting a devastating civil war with this exact population. So letting them back inside the country would be a security nightmare, creating a fifth column, aka an enemy from within. And yes, it is true that 150,000 Palestinian Arabs did remain there. That did happen. And to be clear, the Israelis weren't wrong about how much this population hated them and didn't want them to exist there, that didn't want a Jewish state. Between 1949 and 1956, a steady stream of Fedayeen, Palestinian guerrilla fighters trained and sponsored by Egypt, sneaked over the border to raid, steal, and murder hundreds of Israeli civilians and soldiers, which didn't exactly entice Israel into repatriating anyone. So 300,000 people waited in limbo, their numbers growing by the day. And then the UN stepped in. God bless them. They do love to show up to the party fashionably late. Kind of like Michael Scott at Pam and Jim's wedding in The Office, Season 6, Episode 5, Niagara Part 2, if you're wondering. The UN appointed an experienced Swedish mediator named Folke Bernadotte, who had successfully negotiated other tricky situations during World War II. And to be fair, he did manage to set up the first truce of the war, which lasted for nearly a month. But when it came to the refugees, Bernadotte was, shall we say, highly idealistic. Another way to say not so realistic. His first suggestion was, hey, Israel, what if you repatriate all 300,000 Palestinian Arabs who have left so far? Just do that. The Israelis predictably laughed him out of the room. So he tried again, this time with a lower number. And once again, the Israelis channeled the immortal words of Ben Stiller in Night at the Museum, I don't think so. Israel finally decided on a policy towards the refugees, and that policy was no refugee will be allowed back. I mean, wasn't that more or less the point of partition, to establish two states for two nations who were unable to play nicely with each other, who couldn't sandbox? It was decided no refugee would be allowed to return. And of course, some did, roughly 25,000 in fact. Remember, Bernadotte had brokered a month-long truce in June of 1948, and tens of thousands of refugees made use of the relative peace and quiet to get back to their homes, which made the Israelis very unhappy. So the IDF formulated a new policy for the soldiers defending the borders. If anyone tries to come back, shoot them. Uri Avneri was 25 years old in 1948, already a veteran of the Irgun, the hardline paramilitary that fought the British mandate. Later in life, he became a historian and a peace activist. Honestly, it's not a surprising trajectory, because here he was describing the new IDF policy.
Then one day we got an order to take the jeeps and spread out and to shoot every Arab whom we saw coming back. And this is what happened.
It's awful, it's harsh, it's war, and it's eat or be eaten when the enemy's plenty clear about their intentions. Various Arab commanders had made sweeping declarations like, and listen to these carefully, Azam Pasha, the Secretary General of the Arab League, said, "This will be a war of extermination and a momentous massacre, which will be spoken of like the Mongolian massacres and the Crusades." That's what the Jewish state was contending with. The Arab Liberation Army was a lot more succinct. Their emblem was a Star of David pierced by a sword. A picture is worth 1,000 words, I guess. The Israelis weren't going to take any chances. An enemy is an enemy, and you have no obligation to let your enemy overrun your borders. The Jewish state had made its position on refugee resettlement very clear. But the Jewish state was tiny and not particularly powerful. Like, get 2025 when I'm recording this out of your head. Think of 1948, a few years after the Holocaust. 6 million Jews decimated. A third of world Jewry killed off. A tiny new state is emerging. 600,000 or so people. Tiny. Meanwhile, the Arab states were putting heavy pressure on American diplomats throughout the Middle East. So the U.S. had a vested interest in ending this whole refugee issue, as did the UN, obviously. But Bernadotte wouldn't live to broker a compromise. He was assassinated in September of 1948 by members of Lehi, the hardline paramilitary group that had caused such a headache for Ben-Gurion during the days of the British mandate. But if Lehi thought that getting rid of Bernadotte would resolve this whole refugee dispute, they were very, very wrong. His recommendations wound their way through the UN's committee process. In late December 1948, a version of those recommendations coalesced into Resolution 194, which reads in part as follows. Resolves that the refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date, and that compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return, and for loss of or damage to property which under principles of international law or inequity should be made good by the governments or authorities responsible. Gobbledygook writing UN language stuff. In other words, let me speak like a human being. Let all refugees come back and compensate those who don't. And remember that it's going to come back. But maybe you've already noticed a key word in the resolution, and that word is should. As in, if refugees want to come back, they should be permitted to do so. Should. Should is a recommendation, not a requirement. It leaves a whole lot of wiggle room. And it doesn't mean you're obligated to permit a hostile population to return to your territory. So Israel more or less rolled its eyes at the UN and ignored Resolution 194. And hilariously, so did the Arab bloc, which voted no to the resolution. They voted no on it. True, it was mostly a protest vote against Israel's potential UN membership, not explicitly a vote against refugee resettlement, but I still find it hilarious. I find it hilarious because the reality is the Arab states did not want the Jewish state to exist. They didn't. The mid-20th century Arab world had the pettiest energy ever. But it was December of 1948 and everyone was getting really, really tired. As the war dragged and the refugee population ballooned, the Arab armies began to withdraw. Egypt was the first to sign an armistice agreement in February of 1949, then Lebanon in March, Transjordan in April, stubborn Syria in July. Only Iraq held out. It's good to have principles, Iraq. To this day, the country has still not signed an armistice agreement with Israel. Keep fighting that good fight, Iraq. We're all rooting for you. And so the war drew to a close and the Jewish state began to assess the damage. Yes, 1% of Israelis were dead, unalived, but their new country was way bigger than the one that the UN had originally envisioned under partition, with way fewer Palestinians. And to a tiny minority intent on self-determination, demographics are a really, really big deal. Remember, the original plan would have left 450,000 Palestinian Arabs in Jewish territory, but at the close of the war, only 150,000 Palestinian Arabs remained, with the rest dispersed through neighboring countries and territories that had originally been designated for a future Arab state, or what would be a Palestinian state. I'm talking, of course, about the West Bank and Gaza, now in Jordanian and Egyptian hands, respectively. But neither country seemed particularly interested in building those territories up into a Palestinian Arab state. So the UN Conciliation Commission for Palestine suggested that Egypt transfer Gaza and its 250,000 Palestinian refugees to Israeli control. Egypt would be rid of a population they didn't want. Israel would get the world off its back. And though the displaced Palestinians wouldn't get to return to their villages, they would get Israeli citizenship. Wild to imagine now. What a crazy what if. At first, it seemed like a win-win-win. And Israel was totally on board, even offering to trade the Strip for a different block of land in the Negev. But Egypt had no intention of looking weak or conciliatory towards Israel, even if doing so solved a major problem for everyone. Am I crazy, or does that sound really familiar? I'm probably just crazy. So the Gaza plan died on the vine. And so did the next plan, which became known as the 100,000 offer. It's pretty simple. The Americans suggested that Israel repatriate 100,000 refugees. The remaining 600,000 or so would remain where they were. The Israeli government agreed, only to find itself in the midst of a political firestorm. Members of Knesset raged at one another. The debate was furious and loud, but in the end, it was all a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing, because the plan never came to pass. The Arab world insisted that Israel repatriate something like 300,000 refugees. The Israelis, of course, refused. Predictably, neither side was willing to budge. The stubbornness. And so, the Palestinians watched other nations bat around their future like a plaything while they remained homeless, stateless, powerless. Soon, like the Gaza plan, the 100,000 offer was dead too. Complicating all of this, of course, was a different refugee crisis, the violent expulsion of Jews from Arab lands. Between 1948 and 1951, nearly 800,000 Jewish refugees from Arab countries, many of them penniless and stripped of their assets, arrived in Israel, where the state nearly buckled under the effort of absorbing them all. But they did it. They accepted 800,000 people who had been expelled from their homes where they'd lived for millennia. And I do mean millennia, by the way. The Jewish community of Iraq was 2,700 years old when it was destroyed. And they didn't even need a UN resolution to do it, which was convenient, because the UN didn't make a peep about this expulsion. Curious. The state of Israel had a lot of reasons to accept these Jewish refugees, no questions asked. The first, of course, was that it was the only moral thing for them to do. The state's entire raison d'etre was to provide sanctuary to any Jew in need. Well, especially after 1,900 years of being really in need. But I'd be lying if I said that this influx of immigrants wasn't a demographic victory. The partition plan had envisioned a tiny Jewish state with really difficult borders and a massive Arab minority. But instead of the proposed 450,000 Arab people living there, Israel had only 150,000 there. And as more and more Jews flooded the country, that minority became increasingly minor relative to the wider population. Plus, all these new olim, which is a way to say immigrants to Israel, solved the problem. In the wake of the war, dozens of Arab villages lay empty, beckoning their old inhabitants. Now, they would be home to the new immigrants. It was a real two birds, one stone situation, or as I like to say, feeding two birds with one scone. The abandoned villages and fields would be inhabited. The new olim, people who moved there, had somewhere to live, and any Palestinians who tried to return would find there was nothing to return to. Just to make sure that Palestinians got the message, in 1949, Israel passed the absentee property law, which declared nearly every Palestinian who left their home in 1948 an absentee. That included internally displaced Palestinians who fled from one place to another within Israeli territory. But this new law, it wasn't just about name-calling. Being an absentee meant the state assumed the right to confiscate your property. This isn't unusual, by the way. Many places around the world have similar laws that state that after a certain period of time, abandoned property belongs to the government. It's their way of making sure the infrastructure doesn't crumble or become a den of criminal activity. But that's obviously not why Israel passed the law. These Palestinians weren't absentees. They wanted to return. They just weren't allowed to. And if they ever somehow won that right, the absentee property law guaranteed they would have nowhere to go. Once the law was passed, the government razed many Arab villages in Israel's center to create the country's green lung, the huge swath of forest that runs through the state to this day. The green lung breathed, but Palestinians were choking. The Arab countries that had taken them in begrudgingly did not treat them well. Their own Arab brethren did not treat them well. Most were corralled in squalid camps that eventually became squalid neighborhoods and denied basic rights. The only Arab country to offer citizenship, the only one, and this is a good nerd corner alert, to offer citizenship to displaced Palestinians was Jordan. That's it. Not Egypt, not Syria, not Lebanon. Nope, and nope. And that caused serious tension that eventually snowballed into some really ugly infighting. That's right, Syria and Egypt simply did not offer citizenship. But it was Lebanon that really took the cake. Like other neighboring countries, the Lebanese denied citizenship to its Palestinian refugees. Reasonable enough given how small and fractious Lebanon is, but the tiny country also imposed a number of wild restrictions that remain in place to this day. Pay attention to this one. Did you know? This is a good new section. This is a good new bit. Did you know? Well, did you know? Did you know that Palestinians can't own property or businesses in Lebanon or practice medicine or law or engineering? Did you know that roughly 66% live in poverty? Did you know that they're routinely denied building materials to expand their neighborhoods, where I remind you, many have been living since the 1940s? Did you know they're not eligible for Lebanon's free healthcare system or allowed in most public schools? Seriously, if you're looking for a really depressing rabbit hole to fall into, research the way Arab countries treat Palestinians. It's truly a bummer. It's a bummer. And if you listening didn't know that, but have been obsessed exclusively with the Israel treatment of Palestinians, with Israelis and Palestinians, now's the time to pause, to be a thinker, to be curious, and to explore. Only two entities seem to be in the Palestinians' corner. The first was the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, aka, that's just too many words, UNRWA, also known as UNRWA, established December of 1949, still in existence nearly a century later. UNRWA's not the only UN agency that deals with refugees. In December of 1950, the UN established the Office of the High Commissioner on Refugees, today known as UNHCR. UNHCR's mandate was to serve all the other refugees, which in 1950 mostly meant the 1.2 million refugees still displaced by World War II. Unlike UNHCR, though, UNRWA only had one clientele: the refugees of the Arab-Israeli War, specifically the Arab refugees of said war. The 60,000 Israeli Jews who were internally displaced during the war, not to mention the 800,000 refugees kicked out of the Arab world, were quickly absorbed into Israel. Israelis took care of them. Now, Jewish refugees that came from the Arab world, it's not like they were just treated with like roses and like sour sticks and delicious barbecue chips, and now I'm describing all the things I love eating and pizza. That's not like they weren't treated amazingly right away, but they were absorbed and they got full citizenship. That's how Israel treated the Jews from all these displaced places. So UNRWA caters to one population and one population only: Palestinian Arabs. By UNRWA's count, there are about 6 million Palestinian refugees in their charge today. And if you, like me, are utterly baffled by the concept that people displaced 80 years ago are still considered refugees, let me introduce you to a little concept called protracted refugees. As UNHCR puts it, quote, protracted refugee situations are those in which at least 25,000 refugees from the same country have been living in exile for more than 5 consecutive years. And get this, protracted refugee status can be generational. In other words, the children and grandchildren of someone whose refugee status was never resolved are also considered refugees, even if they've lived in the same place their whole lives. even if they're citizens of another country, even if they're Bella Hadid. And by the way, I know what you're thinking. Palestine wasn't a country before 1948. It never was a country. That's also a fact. Okay, Nerd Corner alert. It's a very long one. Stick with me. Have you ever heard people complain that Palestinian refugees are the only ones whose refugee status is generational? I've heard that a million times. And I thought it was totally true, but it's actually not. And if you learn something that complicates what you think to be true, that's okay. I think the problem is when you learn something that you didn't know to be true and now you know it's true and just ignoring it. That's probably the problem. And it is complicated, but here's how it looks. There are other refugees in the world whose status passes on generationally. In fact, as of 2024, the UNHCR estimated that 25 million people under their mandate are protracted refugees, which makes me think that maybe they're not very good at their jobs. Too salty? Sorry about that. Anyway, those 25 million don't even include Palestinians who fall under the remit of UNRWA, UNRWA, right? The UNHCR 25 million number includes the millions of Afghani refugees who have languished in Iran and Pakistan since the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s. Multiple generations living in refugee camps caught in limbo for more than 40 years. But their PR isn't very good, and that's one of the major differences. So the only protracted refugees people seem to care about are the Palestinians. Like, there's this whole irony taking place here. On the one hand, the world doesn't like taking care of the Palestinians. On the other hand, the world loves to blame Israel for other people's suffering. You see what's going on here? It's a fascinating paradox. And that's why Bella Hadid is technically a Palestinian refugee, even though she's like a billionaire, entitled to services from the only UN agency dedicated solely to one group, with 10,000 more staff than UNHCR, which I remind you deals with literally every other refugee in the world. And if all this sounds bananas, Savannah bananas, to you, you'd be forgiven for asking why. Why? Why do we still talk about Palestinian refugees? Why do Palestinian refugees still exist 80 years later? I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but many parties have a vested interest in keeping the refugee wound open. If Palestinians are never allowed to truly resettle, if their status as refugees is never really resolved, there's still a chance, however distant, that Israel will be forced to take them back. And to anyone who understands demographics, that means erasing Israel as a Jewish state as we know it. That's what that means. Today, Israel numbers roughly 10 million people, 2 million of whom, I don't know which one, either which or whom, are Arabs. If 6 million Palestinians suddenly showed up on Israel's doorstep, this would fundamentally challenge Israel's status as a majority Jewish state. It was a non-starter in 1948, and it's a non-starter in 2025. Ready for some fancy Latin? The sine qua non, there it is, of Israel was for it to be a Jewish majority state. A sine qua non is Latin for an essential condition. Its literal translation is without which not, which means in our case, without being a Jewish majority state, Israel can't be Israel. Or without Steph Curry, the Golden State Warriors are not. Yes, I went there. And that's why the so-called right of return has remained one of the trickiest issues in this conflict. It's one of the reasons that the peace process has failed over and over, because Israel cannot, I repeat, cannot lose its sine qua non. Meanwhile, whoever is advocating for the Palestinians demands the right of return. You see the problem? You get it? And I'm not here to offer a solution. That's not what I do. And frankly, I don't have one. That's not how I think. I'm an educator. Tell the stories as they are. And diplomats, politicians, people, educators, professors, people across the world make decisions based on all this knowledge. All I'm saying is, it's really easy to get frustrated by this story. I did several times, which you could probably tell by now. But it's an essential story to know, even especially when it's deeply uncomfortable. So that's the story of the Palestinian refugee crisis, and here are your 5 fast facts. Number 1, when the UN announced the decision to split mandate Palestine in 2, local Palestinians protested by launching a civil war against their Jewish neighbors. Almost immediately, Palestinians of means, that's another way to say wealthy Palestinians, began to flee. Number 2, first, most of the fighting took place in Jewish majority areas as Arabs attacked and Jews mostly played defense. Number 3, by April of 1948, Jewish forces began implementing Tochnit Dalet, or Plan D, to take over strategically located Palestinian villages. Number 4, Tochnit Dalet was never enforced consistently, so every Palestinian village has its own story. But by the end of the war, roughly 700,000 Palestinian Arabs had been displaced, and Israeli leadership refused to repatriate them, despite a UN resolution calling for refugees to be resettled in Israel, that they should return. And number 5, Israel was not the only country to refuse to take in Palestinians. Most Arab countries have failed to integrate Palestinians. To this day, the refugee problem is considered unresolved, and the 6 million descendants of the original displaced Palestinian Arabs are still considered refugees. Those are your 5 fast facts, but here's one enduring lesson as I see it. It's not one I learned on my own, but one that's been modeled for me. One that I read about and think about and write about and try to pursue every day, no matter how frustrating or hopeless it might seem. It's perfectly summarized by Alan Liu in his amazing book, This Is Real, and You Are Completely Unprepared. It's a book that I read every year as I get ready for the High Holy Days. Another one for the Unpacking Israeli History Book Club. Liu writes, quote, it's not about Israel, the book. All of a sudden, it becomes about Israel. Here's what he says. I think the need to have these things acknowledged, the need for historical affirmation is so great on both sides that both the Israelis and the Palestinians would rather perish as peoples than give this need up. In fact, I think they both feel that they would perish as peoples precisely if they did. They would rather die than admit their own complicity in the present situation, because to make such an admission would be to acknowledge the suffering of the other and the legitimacy of the other's complaint. And that might mean that they themselves were wrong, that they were evil, that they were bad. Historical affirmation is a phenomenal phrase. To me, it's the heart of the whole dang conflict. It's that primal, urgent need to have your side of the story validated and accepted. It's the acknowledgement that your history and the history of your people is true. And that's what both sides of this conflict want. They want the other side to tell them, hey, you're right. You're right about everything. But we've been treating this like a zero-sum game. Each side wants this historical affirmation from the other without giving it in return. Because in affirming and acknowledging and validating the other side's history and story, we would have to admit maybe they're right about some things. Maybe something about their story is true. And if it does that mean we're wrong? And if we were wrong about this, what else are we wrong about? For Jewish people, are we wrong to even want a Jewish state? Meanwhile, if the Palestinians were willing to look closely at their history, would they be willing to say, hey, maybe if we had chosen peace back in 47, 37, we would still be living in our homes. Maybe we were wrong to consistently choose violence. Maybe that's why Israel has felt such an urgent need to have a law of return for their own people, for the Jewish people, to have a Jewish state. But that's a lot. What if there is a middle ground? What if we could acknowledge the wrong without necessarily granting the right? Hear me out. What if all of us could say bad things happened and not everything was justified? What would that do for the psyche of everyone involved in this conflict, for their humanity? In 2010, the UK published the results of the Bloody Sunday inquiry, which looked into a dark moment from the Troubles, the violent dispute between the IRA and the UK that I'm absolutely not going to summarize in any further detail because I get enough angry emails as it is. Thank you. Seriously, though, I love your emails. Keep them coming, truly. Anyway, in 1972, British soldiers fired on 26 people, 13 of whom died. For years, the British government maintained that the victims were armed and dangerous, while the Irish insisted that they were unarmed civilians. For decades, the families of the victims agitated for justice. In 1998, the UK set up a commission to look into the events. It took 12 years for them to file their report, which found that the shootings were unjustifiable. And David Cameron, then the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, stood up in Westminster and gave the following speech.
I am deeply patriotic. I never want to believe anything bad about our country. I never want to call into question the behaviour of our soldiers and our army, who I believe to be the finest in the world. And I've seen for myself the very difficult and dangerous circumstances in which we ask our soldiers to serve. But the conclusions of this report are absolutely clear. There is no doubt, there is nothing equivocal, there are no ambiguities. What happened on Bloody Sunday was both unjustified and unjustifiable.
Cameron's speech resonated like a thunderclap across Northern Ireland, greeted with cheers and tears and applause. The UK was finally acknowledging that they had gotten it wrong. Nothing could bring back the people killed on Bloody Sunday. But the acknowledgement, the validation, was deeply meaningful for many of the victims' families. For me, it's Cameron's words about patriotism that so profoundly resonate. It's so much easier and more comfortable for Jews, and no, the IRA versus UK situation is not the same as Israel and the Palestinians. It's not the exact same. I know. And it is so much easier and more comfortable for Jews and Israelis to focus on the fact that the Arab world completely opposed the existence of a Jewish state and the presence of Jews in Palestine at all. That the Palestinians attacked the Jews first. That the Arab countries invaded with the goal of wiping Israel off the map. All of that is true. I get it. It is all true. And it is so much easier and more comfortable to ignore the fact that Jewish people also went on the offensive with the express intention of clearing many Palestinian villages of their inhabitants. Isn't the IDF the most moral army in the world? Isn't Israel the consummate underdog? Didn't they start it? It's so much easier to believe that Palestinian Arabs left because Arab leaders told them to, because it absolves Israel of any past wrongdoing and puts the blame entirely on the Palestinians. Sorry to be on the nose here, or on my high horse, but this, friends, this is nuance. This is telling the story of Israel with as much integrity and empathy as I can muster, as I got. This is it. This is what I got. Similarly, also, nearly a century later, the stories of the refugees still resonate so loudly that many Palestinians simply can't move on, or won't move on. In the same way that a lot of Jewish people and supporters of Israel don't want to acknowledge that Israel did actively expel some Palestinians, it's really, really, really rare to hear Palestinians or other Arabs address the fact that they started the war that led to their displacement, that the refusal to accept Jews in Palestine, the refusal to acknowledge the Jewish connection to the Jewish land, to the land of Israel, the refusal to accept this, the invasion, the violence, the unwillingness to compromise, the current behavior of Arab governments, the current behavior of the Palestinian governments, by the way, governments, the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, all contributed to this ongoing problem. Because to admit those wrongs would be to admit to an inconvenient truth, and no one wants to do that. But this conflict, heck, this life, demands us to hold multiple truths at once. The fight for Israel's existence was justified and necessary. For the Jewish people longing for the Jewish people's homeland, it's encoded in the Jewish people's own sense of peoplehood. More practically, we, the Jewish people, needed the law of return to account for 2 millennia of endless persecution. And in the course of creating the state, the Jewish people, the new Jewish state, did ugly things. And there are 700,000 unique and individual and tragic stories about each of those things. So when I'm struggling to figure out what to think and believe, I think about the commander who signed the order expelling the people of Lita and Ramla. He was 26 years old, already a veteran of the Palmach, the elite strike force of the Haganah. Unlike so many of his soldiers, he was a Sabra, meaning he was a native Israeli born in Jerusalem to a pair of idealistic labor Zionists who had fled Eastern Europe to make the desert bloom. His name was Yitzhak Rabin, and he couldn't have known that in just a few decades, he would be inking peace deals with the Palestinians. He also couldn't have known that shortly afterwards, he would be assassinated by a fellow Jew because he believed, maybe foolishly, maybe the time was wrong, in peace and coexistence. I don't think, and by the way, by no means am I justifying the assassination of him at all. I don't think this fact will ever stop haunting me because it's so deeply emblematic of the most important opportunity we can seize. And that's the opportunity to change how we think, to change how we approach this conflict, to change what we're willing to acknowledge. But it's going to take a long time for that to happen. Because the most recent Pew poll asked Israelis about the biggest obstacle to peace. There are a lot of them, but the most common one wasn't Jerusalem or the Israeli government or even the right of return. Across the political spectrum, across religious observance, across ethnic background, 75% of Israelis said the same thing. The lack of trust is a major obstacle to peace. Israelis do not trust that the Palestinians want there to be a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. They believe the Palestinians simply want one state from the river to the sea, that the concept of a Jewish state in the land of Israel should not be. The insistence on the right of return has a lot to do with that lack of trust. Because if you insist that 6 million Palestinians should be able to enter Israel as citizens, pause for a second and consider the implications. It can seem like a noble and maybe banal request, but dig deeper. And I think you might see something else as well. What you're really saying is that Israel should not exist as a Jewish state. And that's a non-starter. A call for the end of the Jewish state wrapped up in the language of refugee rights. Israelis are not idiots. They know what the right of return really means. And they are not willing to give up on having a Jewish state. We the world, we've been in that movie, as they say in Hebrew. We've seen how it ends. So all this having been said, let's all of us begin our dialogues by laying our cards on the table and admitting the messy, complicated truth. Let's be honest about our own truths and about the truths of the other side. Only then can we move forward. Unpacking Israeli History is a production of Unpacked, an OpenDor Media brand. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend who you think will appreciate it, and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps other people find our podcast. It really does. And you know I love to say this. Shoot me a note and hit me up. Noam at unpacked.media. This episode was produced by Refugee Stern. Our team for this incredibly complicated episode includes Adi Elbaz and Esther Baruch, who did a brilliant job writing this and researching and editing and everything, and Rob Pera. I'm your host, Noam Weissman. Thanks for joining us. See you next week.